Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on.
Two Wackos at Camp, submitted by Jazz 101. A few years ago, my friends and I decided to go camping in an area that we had been camping before. This was before COVID, obviously. We were hoping to get back soon. We always liked going there because it was such a laid-back atmosphere, and there weren't always a ton of people at this campground. There were only about 10 spots for people to pitch tents, one communal bathroom, and limited water. Zero electricity at any of the sites. We got there early on a Friday evening and saw the sign-in cabin was empty. There was a sign on the door with an arrow pointing to a wooden box that just said Honor Box. Normally there was a guy working there to take your money, but for whatever reason, this weekend it looked like they were just asking people to be cool and honest about the $18 site rental per night. We were planning on staying 2 nights, so I threw in $40, and that's when a guy came around the side of the cabin. He was wearing a green shirt and khaki pants, but he didn't look like he really worked at the campsite. I asked him if he wanted to get the money out of the Honor Box, and he said no, but he appreciated that we were doing it and he would take care of things later. There was almost no one else at this secluded campground, so with a wave of his hand, he said, "Hey, take whatever site you'd like." All of the sites were in a loop with nothing but forest behind them. The bathroom was kind of in the middle of the loop, along with a spigot for water. So as we drove around, we decided to take the campsite at the far end of the loop, the farthest from the cabin, but it was still in sight. Then we set up our stuff. It was a warm summer weekend, and we were just looking forward to relaxing and hanging out. I suppose I should mention that it was my friend Nate, Chris, and myself. We were all in our mid-20s and looking for some time away from our girlfriends. It's funny how when you're in high school, all you wanted was a girlfriend, and then a few years later, all you want to do is get away from them. We unloaded my Jeep with all of our gear from the roof rack, and Nate volunteered to go back to a general store not too far away to load up back with firewood. Chris and I got to work setting up my big tent and getting things ready for a dinner of steak and potatoes and lots of beer. We talked about how it was kind of cool that no one else was out here. I mean, usually when we came, at least 3/4, if not all, of the sites were full with people of varying ages and families. And we didn't care. It meant that if we got a little rowdy or the music got a little too loud, we probably wouldn't have anyone to contend with, and no one would be complaining if no one was there. Nate got back, we got the fire going, and we enjoyed cooking steaks over the fire and having some Previa brew. Just enjoying the darkening summer evening. We all had cell phones, but we'd agreed to try not to use them, or if we had to keep it to a minimum. We just wanted to enjoy nature and our company. Now that I write that sentence, I laugh at the word company, because company is what we got, and it was not the kind we asked for. Around 9:30, it was completely dark, and only the flames of the fire were lighting up our campsite in our faces. This older guy wandered over to our site and said hello. He looked really disheveled, and immediately I didn't want him around. But Nate was one of those guys who was always super friendly to anyone he met, and offered the guy a beer and some Doritos. The guy was very thankful, sat down, and introduced himself as Sam. He said he was in a campsite on the other side of the loop. To be honest, none of us had been paying attention to see if anyone actually pulled up or set up a camp, as we were busy taking on care of the things that we were taking care of. As the evening wore on and the beers kept flowing, Sam started to become really belligerent. He wasn't going off on any of us, but his words were a little alarming as they took on a lot of racial tones, and not in a good way. Lots of N-word this and J-word that, and so on. The first one of his jokes was kind of funny, but then things got really serious with the way he was talking, and it was making me very uncomfortable. After a while, I decided to get up and go take a leak, and when I got back, I motioned for Chris to come help me with something, and I told him, "Man, I really think we need to ask this guy to leave. He's starting to bother me with all this stuff." Now, I'm not perfect, and I've said enough stuff in my time to be sorry for, but this guy was edging on the side of white power and white supremacy stuff. I just didn't want that anywhere near me or in my life. Chris agreed, and he ended up talking to Nate, and Nate also agreed that it was time for this guy to head back to his campsite. We told him that we were going to close things down for the night, and Sam thanked us for the beer, grabbed another one from the cooler, and then wandered away into the dark. We all decided honestly to wrap it up for the night and douse the fire. We put all of our food back into my Jeep and then crawled into the tent. At about 2:30 in the morning, I heard someone walking towards our tent. I had not had as many beers as the other guys. Nate was snoring away, and Chris was out like a light. I just lay there listening to what I knew were human footsteps coming towards the tent. After a few minutes, the footsteps stopped, and I saw a flashlight go on and play around our campsite. Then I heard someone jiggling the handles on all four doors of my Jeep, and then the light came right over to our tent. I'd been nudging Chris to wake up, and he finally did. And that's when a green light came through the tent fabric as the flashlight played on the outside of it. I called out, "Hey, what do you want?" There was a gruff laugh, and a voice said,
"Don't fuck with me. Throw your wallets outside the tent, but don't you dare come out. I have a gun pointed right at you. Just do what I say."
I looked in Chris's direction in the dark and whispered, "Dude, what do we do?" The guy heard me and said,
"I suggest you do what I just told you to do, dummy."
We woke Nate up and said, "Look, there's a guy outside with a gun and he wants our wallets. I think we shouldn't do anything stupid and just give him our stuff." But I also made a motion with my arms to both of their arms to give them the idea that we needed to stall and see how we could resolve the situation. I called out, "Hey, my wallet's actually in my car, so I don't know what you want me to do about that." Chris said, "Dude, I don't even have any money on me, and I don't have any credit cards." Nate said that he would look in his pack for his wallet, and we could tell the guy was getting really impatient. He was on the edge of yelling at us to hurry up. That's when we heard a massive thump and saw the flashlight drop, as well as the green light that had been playing on our tent wall. We heard another voice say, "You guys can come out," and we realized who it was. It was Sam. Yeah, that guy. We immediately unzipped the tent and crawled out, and lying on the ground was the guy in the green shirt and khaki shorts that we had seen earlier. He had been smacked in the head by Sam, who was holding a very thick stick, and I grabbed my phone from my pocket and called the local sheriff. It took them a while to come out, and the guy that had been hit was still kind of groggy lying there on the ground. Sam just stood there drinking more of our beer, and said that he had noticed the flashlight and the green light wandering around the campsites before he decided to retire. But that made him nervous, so he didn't. Eventually, the sheriff showed up, ran the guy's ID, and saw that he had 2 open warrants on him, and he put him in his car. So the story was, this guy, outside of his criminal activity, every once in a while he would pose as a worker at the campsite and break into the honor box. Apparently they'd been having a really good season, and just recently stopped having a lot of attendance. The guy was smart and wouldn't always take everything. He always just took what he thought he needed. His green light? It was not a gun. It was just a laser pointer that looked like a laser sight someone might have on a real gun. The sheriff asked if we were okay and if anything had been taken. We said no, we were just going to ride out the night and take off in the morning. He got all of our information and names and stuff, and when we had gotten there and that kind of thing. Sam looked at us one more time and said goodnight, and then wandered away. I looked at my buddies and said, "Guys, let's pack up and get the hell out of here." I mean, even though Sam had come to our rescue, I didn't trust him either. All of his negative rhetoric and racism, he seemed like he had some pretty serious issues and certainly could have been a loose cannon for all we knew. We quickly packed up and left our unused firewood at the campsite. I wrote a note to leave in the honor box that whoever wanted it could keep it, and I'm sure the sheriff was going to be following up with whoever they needed to as far as the authorities go about that place. By now it was close to 5 in the morning when we left. We all had a beer on the way to a Greasy Spoon not too far from the campsite. We wanted to grab something to eat before the rest of the drive home. I haven't been back there, and I don't plan on going back. There's a lot of other places to camp, and like I said, while I appreciate what that Sam guy did for us, that whole place just gave off a really weird vibe that I will never shake. The Silence, submitted by WB. Back in the 80s, one time I went out on a sort of scouting camping trip for the upcoming hunting season in a place called Huffaker Mountain in Washington State. I wanted to scout out some prime deer spots for my family and friends, but I also wanted a break from work and the rat race. I got all my kit together, got in my trusty Bronco, and made out for the area with light gear fit for a late spring. It was still cold, but I knew I could get by with my tent and a reflector fire, along with my MREs. The drive took about 4 hours, and it was still midday when I got to where I was going to park and then hike in. It's been a long time, but I remember it so well. Gorgeous day with plenty of woodland and meadow noises from the fauna and fowl. I only stopped once on my hike to have a chew of Red Man and kept moving to the spot I wanted to scope out. I didn't see anyone else out there that day, probably because it was midweek and the summer hikers and campers weren't out in full force yet. It felt like I was all alone, because I was. I found a place to set up a small camp next to a stream. It was a little rocky area with some flat grassland next to it where I could pitch my tent and safely build a reflector fire on the rocks and sand between me and the water. I tried my hand at some fishing, but got nothing, so I just enjoyed the cold, clean water as I got a fire going and prepared an MRE. I was planning to check the rest of the area the next day, so I wanted to make sure that I got plenty of sleep and was up early. I stoked the fire, had some coffee, and just listened to the wilderness as night fell. And that's when I noticed it. Nothing. Outside of the fire crackle and the stream burbling, there was nothing. No birds, no bats, no animal noises of any kind. Any hunter knows that this is a precarious situation, especially this far out into the wild. It could have been anything, a bear, a lion. There's never simply silence out here unless there's a reason. So I sat and listened to all that nothingness and kept looking around. And that's when I heard it. Heavy thudding footsteps, breaking twigs and leaves, crunching, coming from off to my left. It wasn't the sound of a deer or elk. Hell, most of the time they're silent. It was too heavy to be a lion, and it was too methodical to be a bear. The grass to my left was high enough that I couldn't see over it, so I just sat and listened. And suddenly there was a loud grunt. Some splashing as whatever this thing was wading across the creek, and then it went into the brush on the other side. I sat there frozen for a solid 10 minutes before picking up my rifle and walking towards what I had heard go by. And then I noticed all the woodland sounds came back. Frogs, night birds, everything. I scouted around to see if I could find anything with my flashlight and came across some footprints in the mud right before the water's edge. Big footprints. I didn't measure them, but my foot is a little over 12 inches, and this was a good 6 inches longer and way wider. I looked across the stream, and that's when I heard a faraway howl. I'd never believed in Sasquatch, no matter all the tales I'd heard growing up in the Pacific Northwest. But that night I made a quick decision to clear out and head home in the darkness despite the danger. I was not going to wait for whatever I had heard to come back, Sasquatch or not. It took me a lot longer to get back to my truck, obviously, but I was dead set on sleeping in it rather than being out in the open, even though it was miles from where I'd heard what I'd heard. When I got back home, I asked everyone I knew if they had ever heard anything like that happening, and one friend told me that he had. I'd never heard or saw anything for decades of hunting and fishing and camping. I don't know. Maybe this was my lucky night. Years later, that Bigfoot show came out on TV, and I found out that Lewis County has had a lot of reports of Sasquatch, and I wonder if I had indeed come close to one. I wish I had seen it, if that's what it really was. Something from the Sky, submitted by Andy J. When I graduated from college in 2015, my parents bought me a really high-end telescope as a present. I was into astronomy, but a biology major, and I suppose they are at least related by my interest in the sciences. My best friend Ryan was and is a photographer, also interested in the night sky. We decided to get our girlfriends Renee and Lana and head out to the country for a camping trip, and to check out the moon and planets with no light pollution. I can't stress that enough. If you love stars and planets, get out of any of the cities or suburbs you live in. If you've never looked up without any light pollution, man, it is some of the most beautiful things you will ever see. Renee's family had a bunch of land about an hour and a half outside of the city we lived in upstate New York. There was an old abandoned farmhouse, but the land was kept by the family for hunting and fishing, and the ponds that were dotting the landscape. Ryan and I loaded up my truck and his car for a few days outside. A couple of tents, camp stove, all the food we would need, and coolers full of refreshments. I had also just purchased a solar shower that I wanted to use, and everyone was making fun of me about it. I mean, it is kind of a sidebar, but I will say this. I swear by those things, and I will never go camping in the middle of nowhere without one. They really do work. Anyway, we made the drive in, turned into the dirt road that eventually turned into more of a grassy road. Just 2 tire tracks with grass growing up in the middle. We found a great spot to stop right next to a pond, and immediately Ryan and I jumped out of our vehicles, stripped off our clothes, and jumped into the water. No, not naked, just boxer shorts. The girls were laughing, and we were trying to coax them into the water too, but they weren't going for it yet, not without bathing suits. We got our area staked out, pitched our tents, and I was reading up on my new telescope. I had 2 others, but this one was new, and the attachment that Ryan had brought to take pictures with was something new to me. It was going to be a very clear night, and I was so excited to show my friends Jupiter, Saturn, and all the other neat things that a telescope provides. Yeah, I sound like a nerd, but, well, I guess I'm a nerd. That afternoon, we all decided to enjoy a swim and then had hot dogs and hamburgers for dinner. We're kind of scoping out the area that we were in. The abandoned farmhouse was totally off limits for a good reason. The thing looked like if a strong wind came, it would knock it over, and there was no way we were going anywhere near that death trap. There was a little rise up a hill from the place that we were at, and I thought that would be a perfect place to set up the telescope once we had a campfire going, and night really fell. I had my star charts and knew exactly where to look and how to program the telescope to show us the really cool things that you can see. And that's what we did. We all took a beverage of choice out there, and I started showing the planets and other neat things based on what was out in the sky. Ryan took some really cool shots of the moon, and he was going to break out his laptop later to do the whole Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever it is photographers do with their photos. I was excited to see the pictures. I mean, it wasn't a full moon, and Ryan said that that was optimal because a full moon apparently doesn't show off a lot of the features on the surface. All right, again, I'm rambling, but this is where things kind of go haywire. It was about midnight, and I was thinking about packing up stuff when we noticed a bright flash in the sky. The girls had gone back to the campfire, and Ryan and I looked at each other and thought, oh boy, is there a storm coming? Was that lightning? There was another flash a ways away from our camp, by some woods. The flash was directly over the trees, and I said, man, that is not lightning. The flash was so bright it literally lit everything up. I couldn't tell you how far away it was, because when you're out in the middle of nowhere, everything looks closer than it really is. If you don't believe me, go for a hike sometime. Look at a distant hill and start walking towards it. What looks like a quarter of a mile away is probably closer to 2 or 3 miles. It's just one of those things when you're out in the wilderness. I grabbed my spotting scope and looked through it towards the trees, but it was so dark I couldn't really see anything. I mean, how could I? Even the light from the moon was not bright enough to show what was going on at the edge of the trees. But that's when a bright light lit up inside the trees, and I could see that something was going on. It looked like a construction site at night before the light finally went off. Ryan asked me if Renee knew if anybody lived over there. I mean, maybe we were just looking at someone's cabin and their outside lights or whatever came on. There was power running down the main road to get to these places, but I was not under the impression that there was power running out to individual cabins. We did find out the next day that that was the case, but there was no cabin where we saw the light coming from. And that's beside the point, about what I'm going to tell you next. We packed up all my stuff and went back to the campfire and had a couple more refreshments before deciding to head to our tents. After putting out the fire, we all fell asleep, and the cool night air was coming through one of the windows in my tent that I had left open. The other 2 windows and door were zipped shut. Renee and I snuggled together and then dozed off. But something woke me up around 3 a.m. I could hear rustling outside of our tents. I rubbed the sleep out of my eyes and looked at my phone and saw that it was indeed around 3 a.m. Figured, maybe it's just coyotes or a deer that are walking around. Just checking out our campsite, having smelled the fire and the food that we had eaten. But I didn't hear any yipping, and I didn't hear any panting. All I could hear was this rustling. That's when I heard Ryan whisper, "Hey, Andy, do you hear that?" I whispered back, "Yeah." And by this time, our little conversation had woken up the girls. I grabbed my flashlight, but before I could turn it on, Renee let out this blood-curdling scream that scared the hell out of me. She was pointing to the window that I had unzipped, and I looked towards it and saw something that most people will never believe I actually saw. There was, for lack of a better term, a creature standing there looking into our tent. It didn't look like the things you see on TV or in the movies. The big-headed alien with big black eyes. This was a white face that looked like it belonged to a child with round eyes. That's the thing that was burned into my memory, those round eyes. I was about to yell too, when suddenly there was a scrabbling at our tent door as if something was trying to open the zipper. And then something like out of the Blair Witch happened. There were hands or something banging on our tent walls as well as Ryan's tent. It was just like in that movie. And if it hadn't really happened and I had heard this tale from someone else, I would have called bullshit that they had watched that movie too many times. Renee screamed again, and I yelled out, still fixated on the face in our window, and it backed away. The scrabbling at our tent stopped, and everything went quiet. I finally got Renee to stop screaming, and Ryan had already emerged from his tent. I told my girlfriend to stay where she was, and went outside with Ryan despite her pleading for me to stay. We looked around, but there was nothing out there. We were breathing heavily, completely freaked out by what had just happened. I told him what I had seen through the window, and what Renee had also seen. His windows were closed, and he hadn't seen anything. The girls were screaming for us to get back in our tents, but we wanted to have another look around. There were lots of little footprints all around our tents and campsite. They had matted down the wet grass and clearly were walking away from us, and I wanted to follow the tracks, but Ryan said that would be stupid. I argued with him for a few minutes, but then finally saw the logic that walking away from our campsite following some weird creatures was probably a really bad idea. Again, the girls were yelling at us to get back inside, but I told them that Ryan and I were going to stoke up the fire again and stay up all night to make sure that if these things came back, we could protect ourselves, or at least maybe get a picture of them. We got a fire roaring, and I broke out more hot dogs as we were hungry. That's when Ryan and I saw another flash of light from the direction that we had seen it come from earlier. We ran up the little hill, and as we looked over, I had my spotting scope again. There was still nothing to see. Then there was another bright flash in the sky, and as we stood looking in the direction of the flashing lights, I noticed something funny about the night sky. A large portion of it was completely black. No stars at all. There was this large triangular shape in the sky slowly moving towards us. It didn't have any lights on it. It was just this big black shape. We stared at it, and as it went right over top of us, it blacked out the sky for at least 10 seconds before it moved towards the south and away from us. I looked at Ryan and I said, "I cannot believe what I just saw." And he said, "I can't believe what you saw either because I saw it and I don't believe what I saw." We watched this thing drift away and then went back to the campsite. The girls were freaking out that we had not come back, and we coaxed them out of the tents, wrapped them in blankets, and we all sat around the fire and had a snack. I told them that I was going to stay up and watch over things, but everyone was so keyed up after what we had told them and what we had seen, obviously what they had experienced, there was no way we were going back to bed. Ryan took some pictures of the footprints, but really there was not too much to see other than indentations in the grass. It would have looked like anything to anybody who had experienced what we did. I knew that anybody who looked at them would just say it was a deer or coyotes or raccoons or a fox. We talked until dawn about what had happened and tried to rationalize that maybe it was just a bunch of animals. But Renee and I had looked right into the face of this thing, and I know in my heart of hearts that was not an animal. I'm telling you, it looked like a small child. Round head. I couldn't make out a nose or mouth, but those two round eyes, man, they're still there in my head. The next day we decided to head home rather than stay another night. As much as I wanted to stay, the girls were not having it. But before we left, Ryan and I did go over to the forest where we saw the lights. There was nothing there. There was a little clearing a little ways into the trees, but no cabin, and no mark of anything had been made that give any indication that something had landed. I know people listening to this are going to call bullshit and say that our imaginations ran away with us, or we're just making it up totally. But I'm not, and we're not. I reached out to a state organization with my report and had a follow-up, but have not heard anything back. There was a request to send out some people to investigate what we had seen and where we had seen it, but Renee's family was not cool with that. They didn't want strangers wandering around out there. I still use my telescope at least once or twice a week all year round in good weather, I've seen lots of cool things, and I've taken lots of neat pictures as Ryan showed me how to use my camera to capture things. One thing's for sure, I have not and probably will never see anything like what we saw that night again. The good thing is our families believed us. And come to find out, in the late 60s, there were reports of strange lights in that area too. I suppose it adds a little credence to our story. But at the end of the day, I don't care if anyone believes me or not. I saw what I saw. I can't say it was aliens, but it was something very, very strange. I don't know how many of them were outside our tents. They were very curious, but I'm glad they left us alone.
Backyard Not So Safe, submitted by Samuel N. When I was a kid in the 80s, we loved to camp out all the time. We even loved to camp in our backyard. I grew up in the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio, on a street that was full of young families and lots of kids. There were a few older people, and they were always really great to us. I mean, the trick-or-treating was always amazing, and holiday time was also a lot of fun. There was a lot of camaraderie between the neighbors. Our doors were always open to everyone. There's a comedian named Sebastian Maniscalco who does a funny skit about not answering the door anymore when the doorbell rings. But when I was a kid, everyone knew that they could just knock and come right on in. We were friendly to everyone. When I was about 10 years old, my friend Toby came over to play, and we were just messing around with our G.I. Joe guys and whatever. My mom asked if he wanted to stay for dinner, and we'd been talking to see if he could actually stay overnight. My parents said okay, and he ran to the phone to call his mom and dad to see if it was all right if he slept over at our house. This was in the summer, and we'd been talking all day about setting up my pup tent and camping outside if we could. My family had a fairly big backyard with lots of trees, and my next-door neighbor to the left was a young guy with his wife, and on the other side was an older couple. Throughout the day, though, we noticed a guy on the other side of the fence at the older couple's house we'd never really seen before was kind of hanging out around the fence and paying attention to us. He didn't say anything. He just kept walking up and down and smoking a cigarette. When I look back on things now, I realized that he was probably listening to our conversations as we played with our G.I. Joes and talked about sleeping outside. When Toby's mom said it was okay if he stayed at our house, we got super excited and started going overboard with our planning for camping in the backyard. My dad gave his approval and said he would help us set up my pup tent. After dinner, we got flashlights and were planning on seeing how late we could stay up, even though my parents said that we had to turn our lights off and go to bed at 11. Yeah, right, like that was going to happen. We got the tent set up, and my dad said he was going to have a campfire with marshmallows, and then have my mom and sister come out before we went into our tent. We protested, but that was it. When my dad made a decision, that was the decision, and he was nice enough to help us with the tent and let us stay outside in the first place. So for an hour and a half or so, we watched the sunset, had a campfire with s'mores, and my dad was telling funny stories. We kept asking him to tell scary stories, but he wouldn't do it because my sister was only 6, and he didn't want to get her scared. Toby and I said, we'll just tell each other scary stories before we go to sleep. After the campfire, my dad talked to us and told us to be safe, and if anything happened, the back door would be open and to run in right away. He wasn't being a helicopter dad. He was just letting us know that if a storm came through or if anything else happened, that we should just get inside and wake him up or my mom. We were so excited to be out camping in the backyard, on our own finally. We did start telling each other the scariest stories we knew, and a lot of them were from that book, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. We weren't reading right out of the book. We were just giving our own versions of the scary ones that we thought were the best. It was right around 11 when we heard someone coughing somewhere outside of the tent. It was like how I would now describe someone with a smoker's cough. We unzipped the front door of the tent and poked our heads out and flashed our flashlights around, but we didn't see anything or anybody. We went back to telling each other stories, and then talking about school that was coming up. And this was probably mid-August, and we were going back to school real soon. We then heard the coughing again, and once again I looked around outside, but I didn't see anything. And then we heard some footsteps, but it was just my dad coming out to check on us, telling us that we probably should get some sleep, and that he was going to make pancakes in the morning. Basically what he was saying was, knock it off, keep the chatter down, and keep the flashlights off. Toby told me he wanted to tell me one more story that his grandfather had told him. And I don't remember all the details, but it was pretty creepy. It was about a guy falling off a boat and drowning. The creepiest part was, people a week or two later saw the guy walking around town, even though the body had been found, and the guy really was dead. That one freaked me out because it wasn't from a book. I mean, it sounded like it was really true. And that's when we heard the cough again, but now it was much closer. I sat up as much as you can sit up in a pup tent, and that's when we heard a voice say,
Wow, that was a scary story.
It was not my dad. It was not a voice that either of us recognized. I unzipped the tent door a little bit and poked my head out, and in the darkness, but still light enough from the moon to see, was that guy we had seen on the other side of the fence earlier in the day. But now he was completely naked, standing about 3 feet from our tent with his arms reaching out over the pole that kept the front end of the tent up. My first instinct was to yell out, "Go away!" But all he did was put his arms down and then started walking around the tent, dragging his thing across the walls. He did that once, then twice, and now we were both yelling at him to go away. That's when we heard the back door of my house slam open, and my father yelled, "Hey, you! Get the hell out of here!" We heard some scrambling and the sound of the chain-link fence banging a little bit. And without hesitation, Toby and I ripped the tent door open and ran towards my dad in the back door. My dad grabbed both of us by our collars and practically tossed us into the house, not meaning to hurt us, but just wanting us to get in as fast as we could. He looked at us, got down on one knee, and asked what happened. I told him, and he said, "Okay," and then had us sit at our breakfast bar as he made some hot chocolate and got on our cordless phone. He was calling the police, and not long after, maybe 5 minutes or so, a car pulled up in our driveway, and my dad went outside and gave the 2 police officers what had happened. After a little while, he came back in and said, "Hey, why don't you guys go get your sleeping bags and then sleep on the living room floor if you still want to have a camp out?" He was being really cool, but we could tell something was very wrong. I mean, we knew something was wrong. There was a naked guy in front of our tent. My dad locked the doors as we watched out the windows, which we weren't supposed to be doing. The 2 police officers who came over were walking that guy I had seen earlier out to their car, and they put him in the back. One of them came back and talked to my dad on the porch, but we couldn't really make out what they were saying. My dad came in, told us to go to sleep, and that he would still make us pancakes in the morning. We heard him go upstairs and talk to my mom for quite a while, but again, we couldn't hear what was going on. The next morning we did have pancakes, and my dad went next door to talk to the older couple. Apparently, the guy we had seen was the lady's second cousin who was in town for a visit. He'd been arrested in the past for flashing little kids at a park and some other really creepy things involving children. The couple next door had no idea about his past and were so apologetic and sorry that they let him stay with them for a week. We didn't hear any more about what happened to the guy, but I did end up working at my next-door neighbor's hardware store when I was in high school. One day when it was slow and it was just the 2 of us, we were just restocking shelves, and I asked him about that guy, and for a hard minute he looked at me and then said, "Son, I feel terrible about what happened to you back then. But he said there's not much I can say, but I assure you, that guy will never be back. We need to just let it go." I did, and so did Toby, for the most part. We ended up making a nickname for the guy and told all of our friends what had happened when we got back to school. And all the way through high school and into college, anytime something creepy happened between our friends, we always called it a pudgy man. Because the guy was on the heavy side. And it's funny now to think that that was the only name we came up with. Because as a father of grown children, now I can think of a lot worse names to come up with. I only hope my kids never run into a pudgy man. Crazy Camp Guy, submitted by Randall. My grandfather owned a large plot of land out in the middle of nowhere in Nebraska. There were a couple of ponds on the land, and we used to like to go out fishing there and ride our ATVs around. But when he passed away, he didn't sell it to my family, as none of my family really wanted it, and I was way too young to purchase it myself. He ended up selling it to another older gentleman who told us that we would have free rein on the property for our lives. And that kind of made us happy that we could still go out there, but we also didn't have to have the responsibility of taking care of the road and all of that stuff that was out there. When I say stuff, I mean a couple of shacks that sometimes people used for hunting purposes. And that's really all that was out there. One summer evening, two of my friends, I'll call Bill and Ted, and I hope everybody gets that reference, thought maybe we could go out there for a quick camping trip. I asked my dad if he thought it was okay, and he said sure. And at this point, we were all 21 years old and old enough to know that when we were on someone else's land, we needed their permission to get out there first. So we called the gentleman who owned the property, and he said, by all means go and have a good time. He also said that he would come out and see us if he could. We were super happy, got all of our stuff together, loaded up into my friend Bill's trailer with the two ATVs we were taking. I couldn't take mine as it was in bad shape and didn't have time to fix it up. I was just going to ride bitch. Lol. So we headed out the next day and parked at the small area before the shacks, and then took our ATVs down towards the pond where we were going to pitch our tent and hang out. We did all the right things just like Boy Scouts and got a good solid fire ring together, collected a ton of firewood from the stuff that had fallen down in the forest, got it right next to the pond, and of course indulged in a few over 21 beverages. That afternoon we spent the day doing a little fishing, but nothing was biting, so we decided to go for a ride on the ATVs. Ted stayed back for a while Bill and I zoomed around for a while, and then Bill was going to give his quad to Ted so he could have some fun. There were a lot of really fun trails out there, I will say that. So Ted took off, and Bill and I were just sitting in our camp chairs laughing and having a brew, when the gentleman who owned the land came up and said hi. We jumped up, shook hands, and said, "Hey, thanks so much for letting us stay here." And he said, "Not a problem. You guys are always welcome." He also had a beer with us and then said that he had to get going. He was going to go back up the hill and do some work on one of the shacks. After a little bit, Ted came back, and this is when things went a little weird. The gentleman who owned the land came back down the hill screaming at us that we were trespassing and to get the F off his land. Bill and I looked at each other and said, "I thought we were okay to be here." He said, "No, I have no idea who the hell you are. You're trespassing. Get your shit and get out of here." We said, okay, thinking that there was no sense in fighting this guy about it. I mean, something was seriously wrong with him. The guy stormed off up the hill. We got all our things together, packed them up, and as bummed as we were, we just made our way up the hill and saw him again. And he stopped us and said, "Hey, where are you guys going? I thought you were going to spend a couple of days out here." We all looked at each other like, what the hell? I mean, this was the same guy that had just told us to leave, and we were doing exactly as he asked. I opened my mouth and said, "Sir, you just told us that we were trespassing, and you didn't want us out here." He looked at us, and then had this look on his face like he had no idea what I was talking about, and said, "I think you're confused, son. You're more than welcome to stay here as long as you'd like." The three of us looked at each other again and thought, okay, do we stay or do we go? We decided that we were going to stay and invited him to come down and have a steak dinner with us after we got our fire going. He said that he would like that and that he was sorry that there was any kind of confusion. Probably not the best decision we made, but we were there and didn't want to lose any of the fun time that we knew we were going to have. For whatever reason, we thought maybe he just had a quick bout of something and then thought we were someone else. But when I say probably was not the best decision, I mean it was not the best decision. We went back down to our camp area, leaving quads on our trailer, and just got our stuff back out, set everything up again. It was getting on in the day, and we wanted to have something to eat, have a steak ready for this guy when he came back down the hill, as we knew that he would. He finally did come back down the hill, and he did enjoy a steak dinner with us, and told us all kinds of funny stories about his time in Korea and a bunch of hunting tales that were really, really funny too. We were all having a great time enjoying the evening around a fire and just sipping our beers. Around midnight, he said that he was going to go knock off and said that he might be leaving in the morning, but if not, he'd stop back down to chat us up again, as he said. We all stayed up around the fire until 1, and then decided to hit the sack. About an hour later, we heard a shotgun blast go off not far from our camp. And when I say not far, I mean like 10 feet away. Obviously, it woke all of us up, and we ripped the tent door open, and I looked out, and there was the guy, holding a flashlight, shining it at our tent. He started yelling and ranting like he had done earlier the day before about how we weren't supposed to be there. We were trespassing, and we needed to get the F off of his property. I spoke up and said, "Sir, you've just had a steak dinner with us and told us that we were okay to be here." He just told me to shut my effing mouth and get off his property. I just shook my head at that point and said, "Yes, sir." Repeat and repeat. He went back up the hill in the dark. We packed up our stuff again, went up the hill, and there he was again asking why we were leaving. I wanted to remind him that he just shot something off right over our tent, but I thought to myself, and looked at my friends and said, "Guys, let's just get out of here." And that's what we did. He waved at us and said we were welcome back at any time, but that was the last time I ever went out there. We drove home in the night. When I got home, my friends crashed at my place. I told my dad what had happened, and he called the guy, and the guy said that none of the things that we said happened, and that he had just been very cordial and was wondering why we left. I know there's no monsters or anything in this story or any harrowing tales of death or destruction, but I gotta be honest with you, dealing with someone who obviously was having some mental issues is scary enough. At least it was for me. I've never seen or spoken to that guy again, and I'm sure he is long since gone from this earth. Never before had I had anyone shoot anything near or towards me with a firearm, and I'm glad that he did still have the peace of mind to not shoot right at us. I wonder what might have happened had he done that. Ice Fishing Scare, submitted by Jessica. This happened to me in the mid-'80s, when my father and uncles would take me and my cousins ice fishing in British Columbia. It was a smaller lake that we would go to avoid the larger crowds, and certainly nothing like the fancy ice fishing tents that people go out in now. When I was a little kid, my grandmother would always tell us about the stick Indians, and I didn't really know what she was talking about, but she used it as a threat for us to either come into the house at night or to just go to sleep. She said that if you heard their whistling, they were coming, and they would take you away. Yeah, that's solid parenting, grandparenting. So I was 13 at the time, and my cousins were around the same age, to give or take a few years. We had ventured away from the 3 tents we had on the ice because we just got bored of sitting around listening to our dads and uncles talking and watching them drink beer. We were just fooling around and being kids and throwing chunks of ice at each other and then running around, probably bothering all the other fishermen. But we finally settled down and started to head back to our tent area that we had set up so we could have some dinner. However, my one cousin kept throwing ice chunks into the forest at the edge of the frozen lake after we had all gone back. We kept calling for him, but he just kept whipping the ice into the trees. He finally did get back to us, and we saw all the fish that my dad and uncles had caught, and they were busy making something for all of us to eat before we either went back to our trucks or stayed out to fish more.
I voted to go back to my dad's pickup truck, and he had a cab on the back. And he let the heater run, and then we could just sleep through the night. My cousin also wanted to do that, but the cousin who was throwing the ice wanted to stay out with the adults. So the two of us went back to the truck and got snuggled in and just started talking into the night. Sometime, maybe around 1, I heard this strange whistling sound. And it wasn't like someone whistling a tune. It was this something that sounded like it was coming and going with the wind. I didn't immediately think of all the things my grandmother had told us for all of our lives. I just thought maybe it was some fisherman walking back to his truck or going out onto the ice making a really odd whistling noise. It kept up, and I could not get it out of my head. My cousin was fast asleep, but this whistling was bothering me something fierce, and I won't lie. It was something that made me feel like it was trying to get me out of the truck. I mean, I know this sounds like a whole creepy pasta story, but I'm dead serious when I say it was so alluring, it was driving me insane. As I rolled back and forth, the whistling kept up for another hour or so, but by then it was probably 2 or 3 in the morning. Suddenly, there was a bang on the back of the truck, so hard that it shook the entire thing. I froze, but then heard my other cousin calling out to me to open the door to the truck. I told him to just open the cab, but he was frantic and said, "Open the door! Open the door!" So I crawled over the seat and opened the back door, and he jumped into the truck with a look of terror on his face. He took his boots off and jumped back to where we were sleeping in the cab area, waking up my other cousin, and he dove under the covers, saying how cold he was. Not long after that, my dad and uncle were all at the truck, so frantic, wondering where my cousin had gone. When they found him safe with us, they started to nicely yell at him about running away from the tent out onto the ice in the middle of the night. But he said that he'd heard this whistling that was making him feel like he needed to leave the tent and go closer to the truck in the woods. When he got to the forest edge, after he'd bolted from the ice tent before anyone could stop him, he said he saw a large, hairy creature standing at the edge of the forest, in the frozen lake, not far from where our truck was. He said that this thing was the thing making the noise that he was listening to, and that it had put an arm out in the air as if to make him run towards it. He said that he actually started to run towards this strange creature, but the creature then turned and ran into the woods, and then the whistling stopped. And that's when he ran towards our truck and got inside and was safe. When he told his story, my dad and uncle looked at each other and didn't say anything, but said they were going to go get their gear, and then we were going to head home. We were supposed to stay another day, but for whatever reason, I think I know the reason, they said we needed to leave. We got home really early in the morning, and everybody wanted to go to bed. And my grandmother, who was actually staying with my mom at our house while we were gone, she heard the story, and her face went pale. She just said 2 words: "Stick Indians." My dad shot her a look as if to say, "Don't fill my kids' heads with that stuff." But it also looked like he understood what she was talking about. It wasn't until later in life that I did read up on the Stick Indians and all the things that my grandmother had said. It turns out that in our tribe, there is a legend of another tribe of large hairy creatures, also called the Stick Indians, and when they were disturbed, make a whistling noise to lure kids or other people into the woods and their unfortunate demise. But I do know that I did hear that whistle, and I do know that my cousin burst into a truck completely freaked out after he'd left the safety of my dad and uncles. So I leave it to you listeners to make what they think of my story. That happened. But now that I have kids of my own, and I still go ice fishing, I've never heard anything like that again. But I also don't tell my kids about the Stick Indians and plant things into their heads.
I do look back and say that even what my grandmother had said, if it weren't for the fact that I did hear that whistling, and that my cousin also heard it, I would think I was crazy. But we're not. We did, and we're all safe. I'm just glad my cousin got back to the truck and didn't follow whatever he saw on the edge of the ice back into the woods. Dear Guy at Park, submitted by Andy J. When I was 21, I graduated from college and was still working the same job that I had before I got my degree. It was at a local campground in my area of Michigan. And it was a mix of people who had permanent places and others who would just rent for 4 weeks or so, and other people who just came and went for a couple of days. This story is about one guy who came for a couple of days, rather a weekend, but turned out to be one of the craziest people I have ever had to deal with. I'm going to call him Ed. I'm not going to share his real name, and it doesn't really make a difference if I did anyway. I'm not that kind of a dick. Ed had some serious problems, though. From the first night Ed showed up, he stopped at the main gate where I worked to admit everyone into the campground. And he looked really ragged and tired and overall pretty messed up. He didn't have a car or any other mode of transportation. He just came in with a backpack and needed a place to stay for the weekend. He had the cash, so I found a spot for him. But by the way he looked, I made sure that it was nowhere near anyone else and kind of on the edge of a forest that ran alongside the park. When I told him that's all we had, he just perked up and suddenly changed into a very happy guy, rather than the forlorn guy that came up to the office. I mean, mind you, normally there were other people that worked in the office with me, but this week in July, a lot of people were on vacation, so it was just me. I'm willing to bet, looking back on things, that if there was someone else in the office with me, they probably would have told this guy to take a hike. But I gave him a spot, gave him a map on how to get there, and let him know where he could set up his gear. The first night was fine. I went home, didn't hear anything back, and when I came into work the next day, there was still nothing that jumped out at anyone, despite the fact that this guy looked like he had just jumped off a train after robbing a bank somewhere in the Midwest. He was totally sketch. Long hair, really weird beard that wasn't fully grown in the right places, and, quite frankly, he did kind of stink. The second night, I got a visit from one of our year-long residents. She said she'd been walking her dog along the road where this Ed guy was staying, and she said that he was acting very strangely. He ran out at her dog with a knife and fork and said, "Are you what's for dinner?" At first, she thought it was a joke, but then he just stood there looking at her and her dog and said it again. Not wanting to cause an issue, she simply told him that he was a jerk and went back to her trailer. She also said over her shoulder that she was going to file a complaint with the office, which happened to be me. As I mentioned, a lot of people were out, including my boss. I told her I'd go over and talk to him and tell him not to harass anyone, and if it happened again, he would be out of here. She thanked me and took off. Before I could get my golf cart and go out and talk to Ed, another person came over and said that she'd been seeing him stalking around their site the night before. And when they asked him to leave, he just started to do this weird dance and said that there was salvation in God, whatever God they wanted to believe in. When they asked him to leave, he just stood there and kept saying the same thing over and over. "You will be saved. You will be saved whether you like it or not." Finally, one of the guys at the site stepped over to him. He finally backed off and then ran away into the dark. So I figured, okay, I'm going to close the office for a few minutes and drive out on my golf cart to talk to Ed and tell him that it was probably time for him to leave. Unfortunately, this was around 9 in the evening, and we had a huge influx of people that needed campsites, and I had to spend time taking care of all of them. And I kind of forgot all about Ed. Later, around 10, I was getting ready to shut everything down as we always did at 10. And up the road came Ed. As I said, I've completely forgotten about him, but now when I saw him, I remembered, oh man, I needed to tell him that he probably should move on. He already was ready to move on. But what bothered me more than anything was his shorts and the lower part of his shirt were covered with blood. I asked him if he was okay, and he had this really creepy grin on his face and said, "I'm fine. Thanks for letting me stay here. I hope I can come back." And then he just walked down the road. He went out the gate and down the road. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. I didn't even say anything to him. I mean, he paid. He'd been weird. He was kind of harassing other people. But what the hell was I going to say about the blood on his shorts and shirt? So I waved at him as he walked away and got onto my golf cart to go make sure that everything was okay at the campsite that he'd been at. And remember, this is in the night. It was pitch black out by this time. I had my mag light with me, and it was never usual that a customer left at that time of night. I mean, most of them usually left during the day or in the morning. So my spidey sense was a little high that something was very, very wrong. I got to his site, and as I mentioned, it was a little bit away from everybody else because I knew this guy was just a little weird. When I got there, everything seemed pretty tidy. There wasn't an issue with anything that I knew that I would have to complain about. But there was something that caught my attention at the very edge of the forest, right behind the site. I saw a hoof of a deer. I mean, it was just laying there, and I thought, that's odd, especially since deer don't normally lay like that, and if I'd come up on it, one would normally just gotten up and run away. When I got closer, I realized that it was dead. I also noticed that it had its throat cut. I'm an avid hunter, and I've had to do a lot of things to finish off game, but this was so messed up. It looked like it had its throat sawn open with some kind of serrated blade, and I also noted that its backside was completely bloody and also looked like it had been sawn open. There was blood all over the place and all over the backside of the deer. It then hit me about the blood on Ed's shorts and his t-shirt. The light bulb went off, and I realized what actually happened here. I can't say for sure because I wasn't there, but I will bet anyone $100 that Ed did what he did to that deer, and then did what he had to do to that deer's rear. Sorry for that cheesy pun. I just got back on my golf cart, went back to the office and called the police and let them know they needed to call the game warden to come out and get this deer, but I also told them about Ed. They said they would be on the lookout for him and send out a couple of cars to go up and down the main road looking for him. I also called my boss, who asked me to stay on a little bit later to handle all of the issues that we had to do with the dead animals when we had them. I said okay. When they did get out there, which I figured they would wait until the next day, but they didn't, they said there was evidence of penetration of the animal. But they did say it looked like the substances of semens were also on the animal's fur. They never did find the guy, and I just let it go because there was nothing much more I could do. My boss gave me a couple of days off, and the police never returned to talk to me about Ed again. And I like that job so much, but that is by far the most screwed up thing that I've ever had to deal with. I'm still an avid camper and hunter, along with my family, and every time I pitch a tent for my wife and kids, and we're right up against the woods, I think about Ed and the crazy thing that I know he did. I know in my heart of hearts that that guy killed a deer and then had sex with it. I guess it takes all kinds to make the world go round, but I hope I never see that guy again. Thanks if you share this, Uncle Josh. Sasquatch on Camping Trip, submitted by Tucker P. Hey, former Western New York native here, Uncle Josh. I know that you'll know exactly where I'm talking about when I tell you about this story of something that happened to me in the mid-'80s while camping with my family. There's a large state park called Allegheny State Park in the southern tier of Western New York. Part of it also runs into Pennsylvania, but it's obviously a different park. We were a tent camping family in the 80s as it was economical and a lot of fun. We could fish during the day, have campfires at night, and even run to a number of roadside attractions if we wanted to. Back then, there was a serious issue with the raccoon population, and as far as I know, it's still running rampant today.
If my memory serves me correctly, they actually brought in hunters to thin out the numbers of the raccoons. They were that bad. Of course, there's a lot of other animals out there, including black bears and all kinds of stuff, but the raccoons were a complete pain in the butt. One year, as I mentioned, we were there camping for about a week. And the raccoons, of course, were coming on in full force every night, trying to get into everything, including our tents. If you've never had to deal with raccoons that have dealt with humans, you'll find that they're unbelievably industrious and creative in the ways that they get in and out of any number of things, including coolers, vehicles, you name it. We would stay up around the fire at night and see the eyes at the edge of the fire, and then during the day we would collect rocks to chuck at them to get them to take off. It didn't really matter, because they would just come back after we put the fire out and went to bed. We could hear them rummaging around for anything they could get their little dirty paws on. One night we decided to stay for an extra night, so a lot of the people who had been next to us in the area that we'd been camping with had taken off and no one had filled their spots, which is pretty rare, because it's a very popular park, and getting a campsite there back then was not the easiest thing to do. I mean, you literally had to start looking for them in the winter. But I digress, that's not the point of the story. We decided to stay an extra night, and we were up having one last campfire and enjoying our conversation, me, my two sisters, my mom, and my dad. Of course, my dad and I had our pile of rocks on hand, and of course the raccoons showed up not too long after it got really dark. But something strange happened. After we started to see their beady little eyes, everything got completely quiet, and I mean dead quiet. There were also a couple of great horned owls way up above us that would hover around our campsite. We could see them, but even they were quiet and gone. All of a sudden, all the eyes were gone, and there was nothing other than the crackling of the fire. And that's when we heard something walking in the woods right behind my pup tent. Now, my pup tent was up a little bit on a hill away from the tent where my parents and sisters were sleeping, and I was always up there with my dog. But even our dog was silent during this, but very attentive. I was watching him scan as best he could the edge of the forest behind us. He heard what was there. There was something out there, and it was big. My dad slowly started to get out of his old rickety lawn chair. Remember those ones that were just like ribbons that kept the frame together? God, I'm old. But even he thought something was up as we listened to whatever this thing was walk through the trees right behind my tent. My dad at first thought maybe it was just another camper that was lost, so he called out, "Hey, everything okay? Do you need any help?" There was no answer, and the footsteps that we heard crunching stopped. Everything was dead silent, and my mother had a concerned look on her face. She was probably more worried about us kids than anything else. But then we heard this unbelievably loud roar/scream. It's hard to describe. It was kind of a combination of both. I've listened to so many documentaries and seen all of the fictional movies about Bigfoot like Boggy Creek and The Legend of Sasquatch, but it was nothing like that. It was a mix, and again, I'm sorry, I really can't describe it. But it was as loud as all get out, and we could hear the scurrying of the other animals that maybe were in hiding near our campsite. I mean, they were all taking off. We sat dumbfounded looking at one another, and I'm not going to lie, I'm pretty sure all of us were a little bit scared at that point. It didn't sound like a man or a woman screaming, and it didn't sound like a bear growling or roaring. It sounded like a very large beast. After that, it was silence again, and we heard the footsteps continue to move away from our campsite. My dad said, "All right, that's it. Everybody in the tent, including you," as he pointed at me, "you're not sleeping in your pup tent tonight." He was going to stay out by the fire and did allow me to stay out for a little while longer with him before telling me that I needed to go with the rest of the family. I mean, I was only about 10 at the time. So later that night, my dad let the fire burn down and eventually came into the tent with us. We all fell asleep until something woke my dad and me up. My mom and sisters were totally out. We heard something fiddling with the back of our station wagon. My dad slowly got up and grabbed his flashlight, and the first thing I thought was maybe this was some person trying to rob us or take something out of the station wagon.
My dad saw that I was getting up and said to stay put, as he realized that I was awake, but of course I was going to follow him towards the edge of the tent while he unzipped the door. He did and pointed the flashlight at the back of our station wagon, and what we saw will forever be ingrained in my mind. We only saw the back of whatever this thing was for the most part, and I know I've referred to it as a Sasquatch or Bigfoot or whatever you want to call it. I believe in that area they sometimes refer to it as Hi-Hat. But anyway, this thing was towering over the back of our station wagon. I mean, at least 2 or 3 feet taller, and that includes the gate of the station wagon being open. This thing was oblivious to us until it saw the light of the flashlight. We realized it was going through one of our coolers. But when it saw the light, it turned and, without much of a sound, ran off into the forest behind us. But at that point, the footsteps were extremely loud. I mean, this thing was huge. We never really got a good look at its face. My dad, as brave as he is, ran to the car, closed the gate, locked everything up, ran back to our tent, and then again, noticing that I was up, said, "Go back to bed." He went back outside and sat out in his rickety lawn chair next to the car with his flashlight in an attempt to protect us if anything did come back. Nothing did, but the next day we did find out that whatever this thing was, which I continue to refer to as Sasquatch or Bigfoot, had gone through an entire cooler of food and opened up a brand new pickle jar. Some new cheese had been bitten in half, and no bother with the wrapper there, big guy, and some milk had been drank and spilled all over the back of the station wagon. We just packed up that morning without saying much, other than how crazy and scary everything was. But my dad and I didn't want to scare my mom or my sisters. We kept most of what we had seen to ourselves, and just told them that someone had broken into the car. When we were leaving, my dad told one of the park rangers what we had seen, and the guy just kind of nodded and said in an offhand way, "Yeah, you're not the first people to ever say that kind of thing." He didn't really believe us, I could tell. But he gave us that feeling that other people had seen something or had mentioned something to him over the years that worked there. I looked into a lot of reports online, and I've never seen anything specifically in Allegheny State Park. But there are lots of reports of people seeing a large, hairy, bipedal creature in that region. And lots of people don't believe in this sort of thing and think that I'm pulling their leg when I tell them this story. But I saw what I saw. My dad saw what he saw. So we both saw what we saw. He's now in his 80s, and every once in a while we'll bring it up at a family gathering, and my mom finally found out the truth of what happened a few years back, and was very angry that we had never told her the straight story. My sisters thought we were just pulling their leg when we told them, but the look on my dad's face when he did say what we saw made them believe that for whatever reason on that summer night, a large creature decided to pay my family a visit. At least it scared off the raccoons. Thanks for reading my story if you do.
Winter Camping by Anonymous. I went winter camping with my daughter, who is 27. We went on some Canadian Crown land in northern Ontario, real wilderness. No trails, no campsites, no nothing. The weather was supposed to be about 10 degrees Celsius and clear skies. Our gear is rated for 0 Celsius, so we thought we were okay there, with some wiggle room to spare. Nope. We arrived at the trailhead on Friday night and parked the car on an old logging road. Hiked a few kilometers in and set up camp. Tarp, bivy bags, and not much else. We sat around shooting the shit for a while and made a fire, the usual. I wandered away for a pee and realized that away from the fire it was getting damn cold, like scary cold. Looked up and it was overcast. I checked the forecast. Minus 15 Celsius and dropping, heavy snow on the way, and coming fast. No sooner had I read that than large flakes started spiraling down. Beautiful, but not concerning to me at the time. I made an executive decision. We would stay and see how we coped with it. These camps are intended to test our skills and push our envelope, not to relax. We weren't too far away from a helipad rescue site, about 10 minutes fly time. We had cell phone coverage. I had a shovel in the car. It was 10 minutes to the main road on foot. Yep, we'd stay.
To stave off the coming cold, we spent a couple of hours gathering and processing firewood and making raised beds to get off the ground. We put on our extra clothes, ate a hearty meal, stoked the fire, and climbed into our sleep systems just after dusk. We chatted for a while, commenting on the remarkable buildup of snow and the rapidly falling temps. During one of the lulls in the conversation, a distant coyote or wolf let out a long, slow wail. We both did the great big eyes stare at each other and burst out laughing to break the tension. This was another element for me to add to my mixture of stressors. Predators. We were vulnerable. No firearms and no bear spray. We follow predator country safeguards religiously regarding scents, but there's always that what if. We listened to the snow falling for a while. You could actually hear it landing in the forest, which is a mind-blower. The symphony of snowflakes was silenced by another long, slow canine wail. Problem: it wasn't distant anymore. The sound came from within 100 meters of our camp. I bolted out of my sleeping system as much as that is possible and fired up my 2000 lumen light. I scanned the perimeter of the camp and got no reflections. My daughter tried to crack a joke, but I was in full DEFCON 1 mode. I tossed her my belt knife without saying anything, and I gave her a look to indicate that this wasn't a drill. I grabbed my small forest axe, scanned the perimeter again, and started making some metal-on-metal noises with our gear. I tossed all the wood we had left onto the embers and scanned again. There, 12 o'clock at about 50 meters. Eyes. 6 of them. Oh, fuck. More howls, but from behind me. Jesus, I thought, is this really happening right now? I told myself to not panic. They're just dogs. For fuck's sake, dogs. I started yelling and throwing things outward, walking in concentric circles wider and wider until I was about 20 meters from the fire. More eyeballs had joined the others. I didn't want to stop and count. 12 animals at least for my estimate. In every direction. And they were not leaving, or even backing away. 50 feet from me and 150 feet from my daughter. One set of eyes was apart from the others, who were gathered in 2s and 3s. The alpha. I bolted straight towards it, determined to kill it. I made 3 or 4 strides through the shin-deep snow. When the hell did it get that deep? Before the alpha eyes vanished. Just gone. I stopped, gasping for breath, and spun around with my light. Gone. All gone, like flicking a switch. I trudged back to the fire and hugged my kid really hard. The temperature had dropped so significantly that we could not sleep. Minus 21 degrees Celsius. I doubt either of us would have managed to sleep anyways, but our cores needed warmth. We spent the remainder of the night processing firewood, tending the fire, and speculating on how deeply buried the car was. About 4 hours after the wolf incident, we heard them take something down on the frozen lake. We couldn't see it, but the noise was very disturbing, and there was a lot more than 12. Sounded like several dozen, even after factoring in echoes and my fear amplifying the sound. At first light, we packed up and trudged out to the car through thigh-high powder. We found the car buried up to the door handles, and we spent the rest of the morning and most of the afternoon digging it out and creating a path back to the main road. Soaked, frozen, exhausted. Totally worth it. Truck Camping in Winter, submitted by TJ. A few years ago back, I decided to get the idea to outfit my full-size Silverado into a camping machine. I watched a lot of YouTube videos of other guys who had done it and followed suit. It was an excellent vehicle that I actually just sold last year to another person who was interested in getting into camping in their truck. In the cab, I had a raised area for a bed, shelf space for a TV and my gaming system, an area that I could cook comfortably, and the rest of the accoutrements that went for making a campground on wheels. I did have some solar panels on the roof that powered all my gear, but my rig was not as fancy as the things that you see on YouTube. I mean, some of those van conversions are insanely awesome, and I wish I had the time and money to do that.
But this setup was what I had, just to be able to go out and camp whenever I wanted to go. It also served me well on a cross-country trip where I just slept comfortably in parking areas unbeknownst to anyone who was parking around me. The windows of the back cab were covered with security blankets and shades, so there was no way anyone could see into my truck. From the outside, it looked just like a pickup truck, but I was inside probably watching a movie or playing my Xbox or maybe just having a snack or a beer. 2 winters past, I decided I was going to see if I could stay out overnight in some pretty cold temperatures. I chose some state land about an hour and a half from my house where I was going to put everything into action. I had purchased a couple of heaters to keep things toasty warm, and I think that might have actually been my undoing. They did work a little too efficiently, and it might have made a lot of the snow on the top of my truck melt, and I'll get into that in a minute. The state land I was going to was heavily traveled in the spring and summer and fall months. It butted up against a ski club in the winter, but the only people out there usually were in the daytime cross-country skiing. The fire roads that I was traveling on were not plowed, so access out there was only for people idiot-minded enough like me, or those out there on skis. I was going to cross-country ski during the day myself, and when I got out to the area where I was going to camp that night, that's exactly what I did. I didn't see another person out there during that time, was just enjoying the cold weather and the fun after I plowed through the deep powder to get through the more established trails. As the day went on, I turned around and skied back to my truck and was just going to nestle inside, make something tasty to eat on my camp stove, and then watch a movie as the snow started to fall. The forecast didn't call for any kind of crazy blizzard, maybe just a few inches, and had it been worse, there was no way I would have gone out there with my truck. I mean, a couple of inches of snow was no big deal. I went out to go to the bathroom and then got back into my truck and noticed that the snow had started to accumulate on my cab. Up until this point, I hadn't turned any of the heaters on, but I did at that point. I cracked an IPA and fiddled with the heaters where they were and some fans that I had to blow the warm air around, and pretty soon it was nice and toasty inside. I was sipping my tasty IPA and just watching YouTube videos. And mind you, I had my headphones on the entire time. There were no other sounds out there other than the sounds of the woods and the softly falling snow. And that was it. Around 11 o'clock, I decided to turn in and turned off my laptop. I was just listening to a podcast on my phone after I had fully charged it, and I was super warm, full, and buzzing a little from the 3 IPAs I had put back. Super happy, super stoked that I was pulling this off, and I drifted off to sleep. I don't know what time of the morning it happened, but it was certainly past midnight and way before dawn. I started to hear what I thought were voices. They woke me up, and the voices stopped, and I had to tell myself that there was no way anyone was out there. Not in the middle of the night. I mean, this area where the forest is located is nowhere near any habitation other than the ski club, and there are no chalets or overnight guests there. So I sat on my elbows listening for a few minutes after realizing my earbuds had fallen out in my sleep. For a second I thought maybe I was still hearing my podcast going, but it had ended, and my phone showed that there was no sound coming through. I heard a voice on one side of my truck, maybe about 10 feet away. It was a harsh whisper to someone else. Then there was another harsh whisper back, and this one was much closer on the other side of my truck. I sat silently listening and could hear someone or something moving around outside of my truck. I heard someone or something grab the handle of my front door, and thankfully it was totally locked. Then I heard another set of footsteps coming up to the cab. I heard a muffled voice say something like, "Who's in there?" But of course I wasn't going to respond. Then I heard tapping on the window right next to my head, and again a voice saying, "Who's in there?" But it was really muffled and faint. I didn't know what to do. I didn't immediately go to, hey, it's some bloodthirsty cannibals out there trying to break into my truck. But I was also pretty wary of anyone who was out there at this time of night. I'd never heard another vehicle come up, and I suppose maybe somebody else could have been out skiing in the middle of the night, but that didn't seem likely either. The tapping came back, and again the voice saying, "Who's in there?" Again, I did nothing. Then my truck started to rock back and forth, and I knew there were two people on either side rocking it back and forth towards one another, and this went on for about 20 or 30 seconds, and then stopped. I heard the muffled voices talking to each other again, and then one more time saying, "Who's in there?" Then they stopped. Everything stopped. No more sounds, no more voices, nothing. I waited for another hour, not moving, just listening to see if I could hear anything, but everything was dead silent outside. I eventually peeled back one of the security curtains, but there was nothing out there other than the white snow all around me, and I could see it was still softly snowing. I thought immediately that I should just get up to the cab and get the hell out of there, but for some reason I just sat. I kept waiting to see if someone was coming back. An hour ticked by. I had another IPA to try to calm myself down, and then decided that I had to go outside and see if anyone was around. I armed myself with the only thing I had, my buck knife, and I did go outside, slowly raising my cab window open. It was deadly quiet outside. No breeze, just the sound of snow falling lightly. I grabbed a flashlight and I shined it around on the ground around my truck and saw nothing. No footsteps in the snow or anything. No one had been around my truck, it seemed. I couldn't believe it. I know I had heard the voices and I felt my truck rocking, but there was nothing in the snow to indicate that anyone had been out there. At this point, I pulled my boots on and got outside. I realized then that my cab had no snow on it and immediately thought that that's what had attracted someone to check me out, the fact that there was no snow on a truck that had just been sitting out in the woods. But again, there were no footprints or any marks around my vehicle. It was the scariest and weirdest thing I had ever seen and felt. I determined to leave right then and there, even though it was the middle of the night. And for one other reason. On either side of my cab were two giant sets of handprints. I mean, big hands. They were muddy, from someone who had certainly rocked my cab back and forth. Two distinct but smeared sets of hands on my black cab. I hadn't dreamed any of it. Someone had been out there, but had left no footprints or trace that they had actually been there. I finished my IPA, stored my gear, got into the cab of my truck, and fired it up. At that point, I think I was the most scared, letting my truck heat up for a second before making my move to leave. I easily got through the snow and followed the fire road back to the main road about 2 miles away. I didn't see anyone else or any other animals on that short drive, but for some reason I felt the most vulnerable at that point. I hit the road and pavement and drove straight home. The next day I told some friends about what had happened, and most of them didn't really believe me, but that's okay. I didn't have any other proof other than the muddy handprints on my cab, but that was enough for me to say no more winter camping. And like I said, I sold my truck. I'll leave the winter camping in trucks to someone else. Footprints in the Snow by Anonymous. This happened to me about 10 years ago while I was attending college at West Virginia University. At the time, I was really into backcountry camping, which for reasons that will become obvious, I am not into anymore. One of the benefits, actually probably the only benefit, of attending college in West Virginia was the easy access to many beautiful and remote wilderness areas. Just south of the college was this vast area of mountains and forest called the Monongahela National Forest. This region is so remote that the government has set up a huge telescope in the region due to how dark it is because of lack of human population. Anyway, this particular backcountry trip occurred during the Thanksgiving break in classes. I decided to stay in town and not head home for Thanksgiving that year, and a college buddy of mine, who I would often go on camping trips with, also ended up stranded in town. We decided to use the break to go on a 3-day trip down to a region of West Virginia that we had always wanted to explore, but had not had the opportunity to do so before due to it being a little further away than we would usually go. This region, known as the Cranberry Wilderness, had been talked about as being about as remote as one could get in any area east of the Mississippi. There were also lots of stories about campers, hikers, and fishermen going into the cranberry wilderness and never coming out, with no trace of them ever being found. There was another story that I remember about a plane crash in that area, with the plane being found, but no trace of the 3 passengers, alive or dead, ever turning up. I would be lying if I said that this little bit of local lore didn't make the idea of the trip even more exciting. At the same time, I thought a lot of these stories were apocryphal or could be easily explained. As the trip drew nearer, the weather forecast kept getting worse. It had been a very mild autumn up to that time, but the forecast looked like it was calling for ice and snow up in the mountains. Eventually, my buddy dropped out because of the forecast. Foolishly and stubbornly, I decided that I would go on my own. I had done a few solo trips before, and at the time, this didn't really bother me. My plan for the trip was to do about a 10-mile hike on the first day and then camp, do about another 10-mile hike on the second day and then camp, and hike about 5 miles back to my car on the third day. The first day of my trip was rather uneventful. In line with its reputation, I did not see another person. The only eerie thing that happened was at night I heard coyotes howling from the surrounding ridges, which is never a comforting sound when camping alone. On the second day of my hike, nothing went as planned. The trail that I was hiking on was much more rugged than I expected. At one point, I was supposed to turn onto a connector trail to get to my second campsite, but this trail, which was on my map, was simply non-existent. This led me to having to take a much more circuitous route and adding about 5 miles onto the hike. Again, like the first day, I did not see another person. I reached my camp area for the second night as the ominously named Hell for Certain branch, just as it was starting to get dark. The temperature had been dropping all day as well, and as soon as I was able to get my camp set up and my fire started, it started to snow. When backcountry camping, I use a camping hammock that had been modified for winter camping because I find it much more comfortable and lighter to carry than a tent. You can't help feel, though, that when you're in the hammock, which, unlike a regular hammock, surrounds you completely with a material and a rainfly, that you are just hanging barefoot. Exhausted from my extended hike and wanting to get out of the snow, I climbed into my hammock, and as the last light of the day left, I drifted off to sleep. I slept like the dead until about 2 in the morning when this loud noise jolted me awake. Confused and not knowing what had happened, I turned on my flashlight to look out at the small mesh opening in my hammock. I could tell by looking on the ground that it had snowed about an inch overnight, but I couldn't see more than 2 feet away from my hammock because a thick white fog had descended upon the forest. I was thinking that maybe I just had a bad dream when I heard this indescribable, unworldly howl. I couldn't place where it was coming from, as it seemed to be coming from all around me. At that point, I was scared shitless and laying in my sleeping bag in my hammock, paralyzed and not knowing what to do. I listened intently, but the woods around me were completely silent after the howl. I could not hear anything moving. I didn't hear that howl again. I laid there for about 3 hours, not knowing what to do, and sure that I would get lost and never be found if I ran off into that thick fog. At around 5 a.m., I finally got up enough bravery to get out of the hammock. After lying there for the past 3 hours, I had finally rationalized that howl as some form of sleep paralysis. I had experienced sleep paralysis before, when you wake up but are still dreaming and can't move and have weird auditory and visual perceptions. It seemed that the fog had started to dissipate a little at that point. My first order of business was to take the piss that I had been holding for the past 3 hours. With my headlamp on and my handheld flashlight and lightweight hatchet in hand, I crept away from the hammock into the nearby stand of trees. I shined my lights ahead and could now see out about 20 feet and saw nothing amiss. More confident now that my experience could indeed be chalked up to sleep paralysis, I relaxed and began to empty my bladder. I then noticed that my stream was landing into an indentation in the snow. Examining this indentation closer, I noticed that it looked like a footprint from a bare human foot. I quickly zipped up and started examining the snow all around my hammock much closer.
All around, I noticed hundreds of footprints and what looked like human handprints in the snow. Needless to say, I freaked out and without packing up the hammock started running the last 5 miles to my car. I haven't told many people this story for fear that they'll think I'm crazy. And at the same time, I've tried to rationalize the whole thing and say that maybe it was just deep sleep paralysis, and that my clearly agitated mind hallucinated the foot and handprints, and maybe they were just coyote prints. But I can tell you for sure that I have not been camping, whether alone or with a group, since that day, and don't ever plan to go camping again. Okay, gang, Uncle Josh here. This one is not a winter camping story, but I came across it, and it is good, so I'm putting it in here. Sorry if it's not winter, but hey, enjoy it anyway. Scary Camping Experience by UT Dirt Detective. I'm what would be classified as an outdoor person. I primitive camp in dispersed areas of public land, and I hike and explore in all areas that are extremely rugged, and often a local guide is recommended for people inexperienced hiking Utah's high mountain peaks and deserts. I am trained and experienced with using bushcraft skills. I do everything I can related to the outdoors: fishing, boating, everything. Sometimes I'm with family or friends, but usually I prefer to be alone in my explorations. It's not recommended even for people experienced with the outdoors. I'm not your parent or babysitter, so I'm not going to tell you what to do. But for your safety, if you decide to solo explore anywhere, please have survival skill training with knowledge of local resources of wherever you are intending to adventure. One of the things I do and try to do daily as my form of exercise is metal detecting. When I am out on explorations, this often includes finding long ago abandoned mines, ghost towns, and other signs of pioneer settlements. During one of my explorations, I decided to attempt finding a particular ghost town I had seen on an old map. I packed my gear and equipment and hit the road. These next few details will come into play during the rest of this story, so sorry if it's like a report. Site arrival. Late afternoon, approximately 4:30 Mountain Standard Time, mid-August 2019. Temperature. High mountain desert, extremely hot and dry. No wind, 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Site conditions. Barren, very difficult to access. Some structures remaining but in very poor and unsafe conditions. Last known inhabitants mid-1930s, left because the local mine closed during the Great Depression. Most recent signs of activity from vandals, partiers, and hunting groups. Access. Inhabitants of former town used horseback and handcarts for primary transportation, and the railroad passes just outside of town for the miners to ride into work. Modern-day transportation has difficulty with access, even with 4x4 and off-road equipment. The roads to access this area are extremely rugged, with desert rock terrains ascending and descending across sharp cliff sides and deep canyon walls. The nearest current rural resident is almost 17 miles away. Accessing this area on foot is nearly impossible. I arrived and set up my shelter, a 2-man tent that requires staking into the ground and has a full cover rain shell. Entering the tent means zipping up the rain shell and then zipping open the front door. I found an area in a stand of juniper trees and pushed the stakes into the soft soil under the base of the trunks and roots. I was happy. It was early evening, my shelter was already up, I had my cooking fire roaring away and preparing itself for the juicy ribeye I was eating for dinner. While my fire was setting up, I performed a very basic security check of my location. I walked around in V-shaped lines through my camp area and then explored the immediate perimeter. I was completely alone, isolated in desolation, with no signs of current human activity for as far as I could see and hear. It was paradise. I didn't see anything of particular concern during my patrol, aside from taking the general precautions of possible wildlife encounters, snakes, mountain lions, etc. I headed back to camp, had dinner, a drink of bourbon, and went to bed around 11:30. Before bedding down for the night, I performed one last sweep of my camp and ensured everything was locked down. I climbed into my tent,
prepped my sleeping spot, put my gun in its normal spot next to me, and turned out my light. I awoke the next morning when the sun became too intense to bear. It was only just after 7 a.m. and already hot as hell outside. My feet were facing east, so the morning sun was glaring directly into my face. I tried to pull my pillow and extra blanket over my eyes and create a shade tent, and it worked. I started drifting back to sleep. Then my bladder decided it was also awake and desperately needed to be empty. I fought the urge to get up and rolled back over, and I started shutting my eyes again. Then I heard something that immediately sent shivers down my spine. At this point, I'll let you in on a little background about myself without going into specific details. I've spent much of my working life in security and investigation positions. I've been involved in hostile situations requiring use of force and been assigned to high-risk cases. During the course of my employment, I've learned how to track and locate humans. With this adapted skill set comes certain abilities, like being able to identify details about someone based on listening to their footsteps. And that is exactly what caught my attention that morning lying in my tent with an overfilled bladder trying to burst out of the front of my abdomen. Footsteps. Human footsteps. Very close to where I was laying. I lay completely still. In the desert, it is so quiet that you can hear pebbles bouncing off the face of boulders from across a canyon. Any movement I made would alert this person. I didn't know their intentions and definitely didn't want them coming any closer to my tent. So I froze, motionless, and focused on performing intentional breathing. In 2, 3, 4, out 2, 3, 4. Repeat. This immediately slowed my heart rate and allowed me to reground my senses. The entire time, though, I was listening to this person walking around my camp. From the sound of the footsteps, I knew it was a male. An unknown age or appearance, unknown height, weight approximately 180 to 200 pounds. His footsteps were alarming, aside from their presence. The way he was placing his feet was in an unnatural and intentional pattern. He wasn't just strolling, though. He was moving methodically, as if trying to tiptoe through the desert. The same way a predator moves while circling its prey, and trying to camouflage their motion so as to not disturb the surrounding environment. I continued listening and breathing, hoping my intentional breathing sounded like someone dozing heavily and unaware. He tiptoed away from me, towards my car. I listened as he tried pulling on the car doors, and I heard him walking around the car, probably looking in the windows. In the back seat is my daughter's car seat. It's always there, even when I'm out solo. I also have things like princess coloring books and a pink-colored pencil case sitting in plain view in the back seat. He'd moved to the other side of my car now, where the footsteps were much further away. I took advantage of that moment and very quietly but steadily pulled the zipper down on my sleeping bag. I took a second to stretch my limbs to relieve the tense cramping and quietly rolled to my side. I grabbed the holster of my gun and quickly popped it from my belt. I rolled back into a more comfortable position and sat completely still again. I listened carefully to what the intruder was doing. He was still making his predatory walk, moving in all directions. South of the camp, approximately 50 feet. Back to camp. East of the camp, approximately 50 feet. Back to the camp. As if he was checking to see if anyone else was around. Maybe checking to ensure that there were no witnesses or passers-by to interfere with whatever his plan was. But suddenly he changed directions. He was walking in my direction, not walking, slowly charging. The same intimidating walk that police officers do when they approach a suspect. Commanding, purposeful, marching directly towards my tent. His intense walking pattern was also making quite a bit of a racket, so he was unable to hear anything I might have been doing. I slowly changed positions so that I was sitting up, making sure to not make any drastic movements that would ruffle the tent. I quietly pulled my firearm from the holster and switched the safety to off upon its release in my hand. I pulled my arms into my chest, raising the gun to the hold ready position, and waited. He was still on his march, almost to the side of my tent, and he stopped directly at the side, and then slowly crept around it, looking to see if I was awake. He then slowly walked around to the front of the tent and stood there. He walked back and forth a couple of times, looking in different directions. Then he came up to the tent door. I heard him undo the Velcro for the zipper on the rainfly. I held the grip of my pistol with my right hand and had my left lying flat and peacefully across the top of the slide. With a certain amount of demonstrated violence and intensity, he yanked the zipper up. He stopped and looked around again to see if anyone had noticed that sound. Apparently not. He reached in and grabbed the second zipper and started trying to pull on it. The zipper that was 5 inches from my knee and the only thing separating myself from this person. The zipper was mildly jammed, so he was struggling for a second and trying to get the track to line up correctly. I took this second to let him know I was sitting there. I squeezed the slide in my left hand and racked my gun as hard and as loud as I possibly could, then immediately put my hands into the fire-ready position with the barrel pointing directly at him. He fell backwards onto his butt, taking 3 sliding hops back to escape while he was stumbling. He froze in place, and I could see his silhouette rise slowly from the ground with his hands above his head. He stood in place for about 10 seconds and then slowly stepped backwards, inching away from me with every move. He continued to walk away, stopped, checked to see if I was coming out, then moved further away and repeated the process. Eventually, he sounded as if he had moved out of earshot, maybe 2 or 3 minutes after I pointed my gun at him. I crawled forward and opened the zipper on my tent door. The door for my rain shell was flapping in the breeze, and I quickly identified my next point of cover, and I didn't see any signs of anyone being around. I dodged from my tent and was able to safely maneuver to the tree stand near my vehicle. I waited in between 2 junipers and scanned the entire area before emerging from my concealment to complete a detailed patrol of camp. I didn't find anything out of place or suspicious after this. I don't know which direction the person went, where they came from, and how they were able to access such a remote location while traveling on foot. To this day, it remains one of the most haunting experiences of my life. As for the rest of the trip, everything went as planned. The town is amazing, with a fascinating life story. I stayed for 2 more nights and didn't see a single other person the entire 4 days I was there. My Name in the Snow by Body Seuss. This past winter, I hiked one of the high peaks in the ADKs with a buddy of mine and camped out overnight. Everything was fine the first day we were there. I had a great night's sleep and woke up early to hike back to the parking area. On the way back down the trail, my friend and I noticed that someone else had been hiking as well. About a mile after walking, I stopped and saw that my full name, first and last, was drawn into the snow on the side of the footpath. I didn't do it. Neither did my friend. It was snowing a bit throughout the night, and if it was drawn the day before, the snow would have covered it up. We got a bit freaked out and decided to hustle back to our car so we could get the fuck out of there. We finally got back to the parking area, and I go to sign myself out of the registry book. When I turned to the page where I signed in, I saw that someone had scribbled out all of my information to where you couldn't read it anymore. No one else had signed into the book besides myself for 3 days. I will not be going back there. He Tried to Kill Us by Cash Dashes. About 12 years ago, while on a 10-day hunting trip in northern Michigan, we were at a place called Deadstream Swamp. We used to tent it back in those days, and it was about the 3rd week of November, so it was cold and there was about 6 or 10 inches of snow on the ground. When this happened, it was time to call it a night. We had gotten into our mummy bags on our cots and had a small battery-operated radio we would listen to while falling asleep. The Michigan backwoods gets dark as fuck. I mean pitch fucking black and eerie. I passed right out this night,
but was woken up sometime later by my hunting buddy Dave saying my name repeatedly. I was sleeping so good, I literally remember thinking it was the radio playing. And I took notice of my name and Dave sounding terrified. I finally said, "What?" Dave said, "Dude, get your fucking gun, get your fucking gun." I was disoriented, but remember saying, "Why? What's wrong?" And he said, "Dude, someone's here. Someone is fucking here." Now let me add, we were backwoods campers. We didn't stay at state parks or campgrounds, and we were a good 40-minute drive back to any road or civilization. I mean, way out in the thick Michigan Huron National Forest. We'd set up our camp at the end of a very long dead-end 2-track. We had been there 5 or 6 days at this point and never saw one other person or even a sign of someone else being out there. So I was all like, what the fuck? And in my disbelief, I mumbled something like, "What the fuck do you mean someone's here? What, did you order a fucking pizza?" Dave was not amused. He said, "Dude, listen." Finally, I came to enough to realize our radio was off, but I could hear AC/DC blaring through the forest and the faint sound of an old pickup truck blazing up the 2 tracks towards our camp. I had a big 19-foot tent with a huge rubber tarp draped over it, so it was hard to tell if there was a tent there if you didn't know there was a tent there. At that time, I realized this was wrong, and no one should be driving up to our camp in the middle of the night, so I reached for my gun. Now we saw headlights moving across the tent, while this truck made its way through the winding 2-track and was within 100 yards of our tent. I finally heard yelling over the AC/DC, which sounded like an old drunk hillbilly screaming, with this screechy voice saying something about, "Hey, you fucking neighbors, get your asses out here." At that point, this guy literally had his truck about a foot away from the door of our tent and was just sitting there revving the engine. It blew my mind this guy had found us. I mean, even knew we were there. That was odd enough. But in my fear, I racked a shell into my Winchester 20 gauge and screamed, "You better get the fuck out of here. I'm not playing around." He just revved the engine up louder and then inched his truck even closer to the tent. I thought for sure he was going to run us over, so I yelled as loud as I could again, "Motherfucker, I am not playing. I'm about to start shooting." He got the message because he backed his truck up and left, but he did so very slowly. The rest of the night was uneventful, and the rest of the trip had a very odd feeling. We never figured out who he was or where he came from. I should mention, on the way out of the dirt road where we turned off to get back to our campsite, there were 2 or 3 old mobile home trailers that reminded me of the movie The Hills Have Eyes. It's just very dirty. Lots of things hanging on the porches and junk everywhere in the front yards, like old fridges and junked cars, and trash. We assumed the guy lived in one, but we never found out. It still gives me the creeps thinking about it. I thought I was going to have to shoot this guy in fear of our lives, and that is frightening enough, to say the least. Messed Up Guy on Camping Trip by Great Big Dork. When this happened, I wasn't as scared as I should have been, but my fear gene was broken, and I had been drinking. But on with the tale. We had a lake less than an hour from our home, and my daughter's friend had never been camping, so we decided to do a quick overnight out there. We, mom and daughter, she was 18 then, camp a lot and like the solitude, so we often try to find the most remote places. No campsite or anything, just drive up and find a space. So we found this nice little peninsula big enough for about 3 campsites. And it was a Sunday, so we were hoping the other 2 groups would leave. They did eventually, and we had the place very much to ourselves. As the night went on, we had a nice fire, had some songs, laughed, and I was drinking wine. We were making s'mores and everything was perfect until we went to sleep. About an hour in, the girls started bugging me to wake up because it was raining and we needed to put a cover on the tent. It was a huge tent, so all hands were needed. By then the wind was blowing and we were struggling, but we finally got it covered and it was back to sleep. Until a motorcycle, more specifically a dirt bike, at about 2 a.m., just riding circles around the peninsula. Mind you, this is literally a small enough area that only 3 large tents plus 3 cars would fit, and there was nothing else nearby but bushes and the lake. There was no reason for anyone to be out there, as it was obvious we were alone. Up and down around the Guy Road, and then stopped. Almost an hour went by. Then up, down, around, and stop. The guy never cut the engine. I just wanted to sleep, so I went to the front of the tent and unzipped it. I looked outside and saw this guy just staring. So I climbed all the way out of the tent and stared back. It was dark and I couldn't tell if the creep could even see me. So I just went back inside the tent, frustrated. The girls asked me what was going on. When I told them that there was a guy out there, they got really frightened. I then told them that I was going to go give this guy a piece of my mind. They were terrified and demanded that I not leave the tent. So I just settled back in and waited. Up, around, circle, rev the engine, idle, over and over. It went on for at least another hour. And by that time I'd had it. I listened to him go down, up, around, all with that annoying blatting motocross sound blasting by our tent back and forth, and then stop. This time when he stopped, I looked out. He was staring again. I was about to go stomping over to go tell him off, when I got tingles down my spine. He was facing directly towards our tent, saying nothing, just sitting there, staring. I realized I had no weapons and no way to protect the girls, and he was between us and our car. I waited. I was outside the tent, but I hadn't made a move forward because now instinct and logic had the better of me, and I realized that an aggressive approach was probably the wrong move. I stayed stock still, just like the rider, for what felt like an eternity. Both of us were staring right at one another. 20 minutes must have gone by. And then just like that, he took off. He drove off the peninsula and out of earshot, and never came back. To this day, I'll never know what that was about, or if I did the right thing. I can only say I'm glad I never confronted him. My gut just told me no when I thought about it. As for my daughter and I think I'm going to need to buy a gun if we're going to camp alone like that out there again. Who knows what was on the mind of that guy? My Camping Stories by Indiana Josh. Man, I've got some stories. I've been doing 3-day to week-long deep backcountry camping, usually either solo with my pup or with my best bud. I've been doing this for 15 years. Most of these situations happened early on, within the first 2 or 3 years when my friend and I were young, foolish, and obviously thinking we were invincible. On one occasion, in southern Colorado, we just climbed a pretty peak pretty late in the day. By the time we were halfway down, it had gotten too dark to see too far in front of us. Our camp was set up much lower down the mountain, but we were scrambling over boulders and crags on a steep incline in pitch black dark. So we just said fuck it and decided to bush camp. Like literally, in a bush. There was this shrub on the side of the mountain that looked like it'd be decent enough to camp in. It formed roughly a semicircle with an opening in the middle where we could sleep in a way that felt walled off and protective. So we laid down close by each other for warmth and managed to doze off. Sometime in the middle of the night, My buddy woke me up asking if I heard that. I listened and could hear something walking around outside the bush. A weird, guttural growling noise. Not deep, just weird sounding. We stayed absolutely still and kept listening, hoping whatever goddamn mountain banshee it was would just move on. But it didn't. It kept poking around the perimeter of the bush, and it sounded big. Eventually, it made its way over to where the semicircle opened up to the inside, and it was so pitch black out that we could just make out a mass, but had no idea what we were looking at. We were completely frozen, just staring at it. My buddy whispered, "What the fuck is that?" And I slowly grabbed my phone, shone the light at it, and we saw that it was a fucking mountain lion. It looked fucking huge, but for all we knew, it could have been a baby. It growled at the light and made a quick movement, like crouched down suddenly, and just kept staring and doing that weird growling thing. I have no idea what came over me. Fight or flight kicked in, and I guess the part of me that took over had realized there was nowhere to fight. So I slowly grabbed a machete next to me, unsheathed it, and some fucking how I jumped up and immediately started screaming and put my hands up in the air and started swinging the machete around wildly. Whatever I did, it worked, and that thing noped the fuck out really quick. It just darted off across the mountain and into the night. Needless to say, we got up and made the middle-of-the-night trek back to our camp, which took another several hours. About a year after that same friend and I had the fun idea to take a week-long kayak trip down the Arkansas River. Only we didn't have a kayak, and both being college students at the time, couldn't really afford one. So naturally, we bought a 2-person inflatable kayak for like $60 and figured we'd be good. And honestly, for the most part, we were. We did puncture it on a submerged tree our second day on the river, but we patched it and continued on our journey. On the third day, we suddenly realized we were going down the river right through hunting grounds at the height of hunting season. There were occasional gunshots going off all around us, and at the time it felt like it just added to the adventure. But the third night and early the fourth morning is when shit got really weird, which I still don't really have an explanation for to this day. We kept waking up in the middle of the night to relight the fire outside of our tent. It was deathly cold, and we also thought it might help signal to hunters that, hey, there's humans out here. Maybe don't shoot us. Around 4 a.m. or so, when it was still pitch black out, but soon to be getting lighter, we were both outside feeding the fire. Something caught my eye to the left of us in the woods. Some kind of light, or something reflective. It seemed to move, and at first I thought deer's eyes. I didn't really think too much of it until I kept seeing it. Something just seemed off. I didn't say anything at first, and then, right as I was about to ask my friend if he saw it, he said, "Hey man, you see that thing over there? The fuck is that?" And that's when we realized we'd both been watching this thing. The odd thing is that it wasn't just one light source. It wasn't like 2 reflective eyes. It was emitting a ray of light like a flashlight. It just seemed reflective the way an animal's eyes would reflect light and appear to light up. Hard to describe, but that's what it was like. But it was only one round object, and it was meandering slowly through the woods, not too far off from where we were. It looked like an eye reflecting light and looking right at us. Confused and curious, I stood up, grabbed my small, weak flashlight, and shined it over towards it, and started walking slowly at it. "Hello?" I called out. Nothing. "Hey, anyone over there? We're just camping here and about to head off." No response. But every time I spoke, that object stopped moving. And then it would start moving again. I could hear crunching where it was moving across and through the foliage. But I couldn't make out a shape or a body form. It just looked like something roughly the diameter of a flashlight looking over at us. Now even more curious, I walked a little closer to it, and it stopped moving. The more I looked at it, the more it really did look like a flashlight, but like one where the bulb was so low and dim and on its way out that there was no light diffusion. Either that, or it was a really big, singular fucking eyeball that seemed to be reflecting light from some unknown light source. Whatever it was, we were both still and just staring at each other, neither of us making a move. It felt like we stayed that way for about 5 minutes, but it was probably realistically a minute or less. Whatever it was, it had been moving closer. It started off probably about 100 feet behind us to the left, and now it was probably only about 30 or 40 feet away. When it did move, it kind of bobbed up and down in an erratic fashion, similar, I think, to what it might look like if someone was holding a flashlight and walking through a forest over twigs and logs and rocks. I took another step forward, really straining my eyes to try and make out what the thing could be up ahead of me through the trees. As soon as I did, this thing started moving straight towards me at a very high speed. Whereas before it was kind of slow and meandering and just bumbling around, this time it seemed intentional and fast. I fucking booked it in the opposite direction, grabbed my friend, ran over to where our little nylon inflatable kayak was tied to a tree by the river, and cut the rope. We paddled the fuck away as fast as we could. We didn't even look behind us, we were just frantically paddling. We left our tent and food and bags behind. We just took off. When day broke later, we went back for our stuff, and everything was right where we left it, untouched. Neither of us noted any footprints or hoofprints. We both saw the exact same thing and had the exact same experience. And neither of us, even today, has a satisfying explanation for what the fuck that was. Stick Indians by Titular Foyle. I'm a Native American based out of Oregon. Back in around 2006, I went on a youth camping trip with some tribal leaders over the course of a spring break. I recall when we were sitting around a campfire winding down one night after dinner, I absent-mindedly started whistling, and one of the tribal leaders told me to knock it off. But then he relaxed and proceeded to tell me why. I learned that there really is a mythology to explain all kinds of things, but what he told me terrified me as a teen. It's the story about why we sleep at night. It goes without saying, most natives are spiritual people, and we believe the nighttime belongs to the spirits. And we give them that time by going to sleep, but the spirits also have these creatures that defend their time. For example, imagine there's a 16-year-old kid absent-mindedly whistling in the middle of the night, disturbing the one time of day that you get to just be you. This would lead to an angry spirit, and being that you're also a powerful spirit, you could cause chaos the likes of which the world had never seen. So out of respect for the spirits, and fear of what they may do to the world, the creatures are called stick people, and they could easily come and take a 16-year-old away so that no one would ever hear or see from them again. Stick people are, according to the legend I was given, entities that will try to cause people to become lost and alone by luring them to places they have no business being, like out into the woods at night. So, I know this is short, and I think about that story every time I whistle, but I assure you, I no longer whistle at night. Creature Camping by E. Dane. It was 1986. I was 14 years old, visiting my dad up in Alberta, Canada. After my parents had separated, my dad decided to live out in a small house in the woods, about a half hour from the nearest town, off the grid. This was his dream, and he allowed me to experience it with him about every other weekend. We would go hiking, hunting, kayaking, bird watching, you name it. We would sometimes camp outside in the woods, and this is where I saw it. It was one of those camping trips I went on with my dad where I not only saw Bigfoot, but it was terribly close to me. My dad and I found a pretty spot deep in the brush to set up camp, and when night fell, we decided to sleep in our sleeping bags outside to watch the stars. My dad fell asleep pretty quickly, but it was a bit harder for me. I remember trying extremely hard to fall asleep that night, but to be honest, even though by that time I had been on plenty of camping trips with my dad already, I was still pretty freaked out by the forest at night. This fear kept me awake all through the night. I remember that at a certain point when I was just starting to finally drift into sleep, I heard something come out of the trees and snapping twigs loudly as it walked towards us. My dad was fast asleep, and now I was basically pissing my pants. I thought some strange person was walking on towards our camp, but as I squinted my eyes open a bit, I could see that about only 10 feet away from me was an enormous, hairy creature that stood and walked on two legs like a human would. Obviously, I wanted to scream out in fear, but I tried my best to pretend I was asleep in hopes that it would just eventually move along. I think the creature, which I now believe to be a Bigfoot, was attracted to the smell of the meat my dad had been cooking. And strangely, it didn't seem the least bit interested in us. It seemed more interested in just slowly walking around our campsite, presumably looking for some of the food it must have thought we had. But I have to tell you that not only was I scared at the sight of this giant hairy thing, but I was also sickened by the pungent and overwhelming odor that the beast was emitting. Eventually, the Bigfoot seemed to get bored and disappeared into the darkness, and I remember trembling in my sleeping bag and not being able to sleep the rest of the night. I didn't tell my father about it until he woke up the next morning because I was afraid if I tried to wake him up during the night, then the creature might see us awake or even hear us, and I was not willing to find out how it would react if it did. When I did tell my dad about it, he just told me it was probably a large bear walking around on its hind legs. But when I described it to him and said that the creature was extremely human-like and walked like a person would, he chalked it up to me just either hallucinating from fear or that I was not aware that I was actually dreaming. I know exactly what I saw. It was about 8 feet tall with extremely long and matted brown hair all over its body, including the face, which to me seemed to look very human-like in a primitive sort of way. I still remember the horrible stench that made me want to vomit. That was probably the longest and most terrifying night of my life. But afterwards, I've come to honor that experience, because I would come to realize that the creature was undoubtedly a Bigfoot, and I was one of the few people who actually got the chance to see one up close. To all you skeptics out there, I understand your incredulity, but believe me, I've experienced it firsthand, and there's no doubt that these creatures exist. I have no idea about how abundant they are, but they truly exist, and they are not only scary-looking and smelly, but they are a fascinating sight to see. And even though I only remember hearing the Bigfoot grunt and growl a bit, I feel that they are more human-like than ape-like due to their appearance and their face. That was actually the scariest part, seeing that not only was there a strange, giant creature creeping around my campsite, but it was very human-like, albeit extremely hairy. When I say hairy, I really mean it. I've never seen so much hair on the body of any creature. That's my story, and you can believe it or not. But I'd advise you to believe it, because they are out there, and it's not a myth. I wish the skeptics could have been with me there that night. I learned from that night to always keep an open mind when hearing about the seemingly impossible, because I myself encountered a creature long thought, and still thought, to be purely a myth by most people. The Maniacs by Eat Shit and Die. I'm an avid wild camper. I live in England and pretty much roam throughout whatever woods I find or like. I mean, the shit's fun. I follow a lot of rivers mostly because they're pretty simple to navigate and have some spectacular scenery. This story is about a time me and two friends were on a little beach having a post-exam swim. And because I felt like it, I slept on my inflatable camping mattress under the stars. I slept pretty soundly until about 2 a.m. when shit started to get weird. There was a little light on account of the moon being full, and there was an extremely light drizzle in the air. I noticed the moon seemed pretty prominent behind me, so I swiveled around to see a glaring fucking torch coming from just above the riverbank above us. Whoever it was couldn't see us because of our proximity to the bank itself, and the bank was raised as most rivers are. I straight up army crawled to the base of the bank and began to stare at one of the two miniature paths that led down to us. Then I started to hear some kind of liquid falling down from the top and thought that these guys were fucking pissing on us. They were probably drunk out of their minds. I mustered up the gruffest voice I could and shouted, "Oi!" at the top of my lungs, scaring these fucking weirdos and passing my British citizenship at the same time, as well as waking up my buddy. Whoever it was fucking bolted down the path, and we didn't see them for the rest of the night. But when my senses came to me, I realized they hadn't been pissing on us. It was fucking lighter fluid, and it was all over my buddy's tent. If I hadn't screamed, I'm not so sure what would have happened, but based on what they were doing, they definitely knew we were there, so it was premeditated. The rest of the night I had nightmares of being set on fire, and it's something that stuck with me. Every once in a while I still have a nightmare about being set on fire. I have gone back to that same place, and haven't had any problems since that time. The Bear by Key Monkey. Driving cross-country with my dog, I planned to camp over in Yellowstone. However, when I arrived, every campground in the park was completely full. So I drove the loop a couple of times and kept asking around. But the sun was going down, and there was still no vacancy anywhere. I found an out-of-the-way trailhead parking lot, hitched up my frame pack, and hiked up the trail for a little bit, then off a few yards to the edge of a pasture. There I cleared a site, dug a small fire pit in the dirt, and pitched my four-man tent. I ate a couple of hot dogs with my dog and then hung all the leftovers and trash in a nearby tree. I buried the fire ashes and climbed into my sleeping bag. So far, I was in the mindset of, it doesn't get better than this. Later, I woke up to the sound of wolves howling in the distance. It was hard to say how far away they were, but it had to have been a few miles. I thought it was just beautiful and started to drift off to sleep again. But now the howling was at the opposite edge of the pasture I was on, still maybe 3/4 of a mile away. They moved quickly, but we weren't worried. The next time they howled, though, they were in the middle of the pasture and eventually were circling my tent. It's hard to say how many of them when it was four-legged animals, but howls and footfalls together, I'd say there were 4 or 5. Both my dog and I laid there silent, hoping they were just curious. After a few very tense couple of minutes, they began to break away and finally moved on. After I heard a howling from 3/4 of a mile in the other direction, both me and my dog relaxed and eventually fell back to sleep. The sky was still dark the next time I woke up, but I felt like I had slept a few hours more. This time, however, what I heard out there, whatever was circling my tent, was much larger. The footfalls were audibly large and the breathing could be heard loudly. And although I never saw it, my guess is a bear. He seemed most interested in where I buried the fire. Perhaps some juices from the hot dogs didn't fully burn off.
But once he was done nosing around, he turned his attention to my tent and circled it a few times. Unlike the way I was with the wolves, I was slightly more concerned that a large bear would breach the tent if hungry, so I reached for my flashlight and turned it on. From the outside, I imagined a sudden appearance of a large glowing green dome would be startling, and I was right as the bear immediately froze in place. What I was doing seemed to be enough to make it reevaluate whatever it was thinking, and it soon began moving away. I didn't sleep another wink, and the sky was now starting to lighten. After an hour of listening carefully, I stuck my head out of my tent and looked around. It was all clear. Light rain had started to fall, so what would have been a hasty pack-out was even hastier. I collected everything and headed back to the truck and managed to find a campground with a vacancy that morning. Insult to injury, after hanging my damp tent up to dry on site, a ranger came by and asked where I stayed the previous night, as they did have a record of me entering the park, but not checking into a camp. I lied and I said I slept in my truck in a parking lot and just got a ticket. That was a pretty tense time, but the rest of my time in the park was fantastic, and I ended up in Portland, Oregon after another week of camping my way across without any other incidents. Weird camping by Tweak. I used to camp at this fairly secluded spot on state land. It's since been discovered and become popular, unfortunately. I've been going to that site since I was a kid, and it had become an annual tradition for my buddies and I to kind of unplug and rough it for a few days out there. However, at the time, a little over 15 years ago now, it was relatively an unknown spot, and it was a bit of a trek to get to the campsite. It was in the middle of the woods, but close to a lake, perfect for swimming. I'm talking no cell signal, no light pollution, just you out in the wilderness. My buddies and I were geeked to get out there and spend the week camping every summer we went. And one summer afternoon, I was the first to arrive, ready for a week of camping, drinking, and swimming. However, to my dismay, I discovered that the site already had an established campsite going, and there were a couple of tents set up. Granted, it was a fairly large campsite, so I decided to haul my gear over and see if I could talk the other campers into letting us share the spot. I mean, who knew? They might have been cool, and maybe it would just be one big party. I got up to the site, and there were no people. The tents were empty. There was evidence of a campfire, so I know there were people there not too long ago. And then I decided to check the lake. Maybe they all went swimming. There was a steep path that led from the site to the lake, and as I was walking alongside it, I discovered some debris that had blown down along the path. There was a sleeping bag, some tools, and some clothes that had been on a line, but now they were all just lying in the dirt. All evidence said that that site had actually been set up for a while. The clothes were wet with ditch water, and they'd been sitting on the ground in the path for some time. When I got to the lake, there was no one there either, and when I returned to the site upon further investigation, I discovered that the site must have been abandoned for some time. But that doesn't explain why they just left. I mean, they left everything behind. From what I could tell, the people camping there had left in a big fucking hurry. There was more clothes. There was food and other gear. I mean, it was an entire camp. The tents were fairly new. It's not just stuff that you leave behind unless you're scrambling and only grabbing the essentials. What was weird to me was that the fire was out, but there was still ice in the coolers and beers, so it couldn't have been too long ago that they were actually there. My buddies finally arrived, and we decided to set up camp nearby and keep an eye on things. I mean, maybe the people had to leave for an emergency or something. We wound up camping out there the whole week, and none of those people ever came back to retrieve their stuff. Luckily, the DNR happened to stop by on patrol, and we filled them in on our discovery. They let us know they'd be packing up the stuff and taking it to a lost and found up at their station. Kind of creepy, mostly weird. I've always wanted to know what happened to those people. Scary Solo Camping by Wet Sasquatch Smell. I grew up camping and doing backpacking trips with my family all over the Sierra Nevada mountains. Being very comfortable and experienced in the hills, I started doing wilderness solo hikes when I was in my early 20s. Some of them will last for weeks and would involve things like my dad dropping me off at a trailhead outside of Yosemite and picking me up somewhere like Smith Valley, Nevada 3 weeks later. I always had a GPS locator with a way to contact my family, and my routes were very well planned. I always take a pistol with me, and the first 2 rounds are always snake shot because rattlesnakes are very common in the area. So this one time I was doing a hike across the Ansel Adams Wilderness with no tent, just a sleeping bag under the stars. 3 days into the trip, I was sitting by a small lake as the sun was going down, and I was getting ready to settle in for the night. But just as I made the decision to stand, I looked up, and there was a huge fucking mountain lion standing about 20 feet from me. I never even heard him come up. The next few moments can only be described as being awkward. I calmly sat on my rock and unholstered my pistol, but made no sudden moves. And I didn't want to shoot the animal, and I doubt 2 rounds of snake shot followed by a few .38 rounds would really do a lot to a mountain lion. If it came to that, hopefully it would at least give it an attitude adjustment, or maybe the sound would scare it away. But there I was, 40 miles from any sign of civilization, and I started talking to the lion. It was all I could really think to do, so I started telling it about the day's hike and some of the things I had seen. I talked about the weather and asked if it knew any good places to grab a bite, preferably something not bipedal. This conversation went on for maybe a minute as the lion paced very slowly, never breaking eye contact with me. And then, after what felt like eons, it just casually turned and walked away. I sat there talking for a good 20 minutes before the adrenaline started to wear off, and I was suddenly exhausted. Sleeping was difficult, especially trying to hold a knife in one hand and a pistol in the other. But once my eyes were closed, it seemed like an instant, and the sun was back up. As I got closer to the end of the trip, an unexpected and unusually high heat wave came in. The temperature was well over 105 degrees at 10,000 feet elevation, and water sources seemed to just dry up overnight. I knew where some natural springs were located, but they were off my route and were around 20 miles away. Without exerting more energy than I needed to, I still arrived at my rendezvous point a full day early. A tire blowout led to my dad being almost a day late, and the water source at the pickup spot was now bone dry. So I had about 60 or 72 hours in 100-plus degree weather at elevation without water. I was able to get a bit of tiny water from a solder still I made and wrapped a bag around some plants, just enough to stay alive. By the time my dad got to me, I was having full-on hallucinations and was in pretty bad shape. Luckily, he showed up with a case of Gatorade, vitamin water, a cooler filled with ice packs, and protein bars. I did get checked out by a doctor in Carson City just to be safe. The forecast had said nothing about the heat wave, and water was abundant until after it hit, so there was nothing I could have done to better prepare for that situation. Overall, definitely a terrifying trip. And after many other adventures, my wife now refuses to let me do long wilderness trips alone.